Hello, how are you?
Ragged.
Ragged.
How are you?
I'm, less ragged. We get to talk about Dennis Peterson today, so that's exciting.
I got two questions. One, did you put this guy here during this week on purpose? Were you strategic about this one?
I thought we're coming to the end of our year, the school year. Some have already concluded if you're in the South, the Southwest, the Midwest. East Coast and West Coast are coming close. They've got a couple of weeks left. And I was really interested in sharing a leader who spanned so many decades. And
That's super interesting.
And so to me, it seemed like we have looked back on this year and have probably thought to ourselves, education will never be the same in some ways, looking at the current administration and changes that are being proposed. And I'm curious to consider someone who may have been doing this for 40 years in the superintendency role.
In the superintendency.
Right. To have maybe some perspective that a number of us who did it for less than 10 years, and so many in the nation right now who are in their first 3 years, I think about 40%, I don't think is wrong to say, is in their first 3 years of the superintendency, that what we perceive to be a house on fire may be true. The house may be on fire. And at the same time, houses have been on fire in the past. How did they extinguish them and rebuild? You're going to hear it coming up here in a second. I will say that I really appreciated, for example, the conversations we're having right now around open enrollment nationwide, and particularly at each state. His perspective rattled me a little bit, and at the same time forced me to do some thinking about at what point do we say that our role as superintendent is exclusively for the community we serve and or to collaborate with those communities that are our neighbors. And that one, so I'll just stop there. We have a conversation with Dennis Peterson. Dr. Peterson was the superintendent in a number of states. You're going to hear about that.
In 67, what was his first superintendent? Was his first superintendent 67? Is that correct? The reason I ask is I was born in 1971. So when were you born, Peter?
75. Turning 50 this month.
Lord, you're a child.
I feel like a child.
It gets worse, brother. It gets worse. It only goes one direction.
This morning I woke up and my ankle, I was like, what did I do to my ankle? Like what? I've been to I was sitting in 3 doctor's offices yesterday, 7 a.m., 10 a.m., and 3:30.
Good for you for getting it all done, though. I just postponed my dentist appointment to, and they're like, oh, first availability is the end of August. Like, oh, hot. Okay. I guess that hole in my tooth will just have to be a hole in my tooth for a little longer. But I ask that because 67 and 2025 are very different time periods.
Mm-hmm.
What I loved was that he brings this perspective on it. And I mean, if I could connect to is it on fire? It doesn't seem like it to Dennis Peterson. Like we definitely seem like kids screaming. And he sort of seems like, we'll figure it out.
Let's hear what you think, listener. So enjoy this conversation I have with Dennis Peterson. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader. I'm Peter Stiefelman.
I'm Jamie Almanzon.
And we'll see you in a few minutes. Today on An Imperfect Leader, our guest is Dr. Dennis Peterson. Dennis is a retired superintendent with over 50 years of experience in public education. His superintendent career began in 1967 and spanned until 2022, during which he led multiple districts across the country. In Minnesota, he served as superintendent for Minnetonka, Southland School District, and Mounds View School District, which is in suburban St. Paul. And at that time, he also earned the title of Minnesota Superintendent of the Year in 2009. And beyond Minnesota, he held superintendent roles in several other states. He led the Princeton School District in suburban Cincinnati, Ohio, the Rockwood School District in St. Louis, Missouri, the Laramie School District in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and additionally, he served as superintendent in Mitchell and Bison, South Dakota, where he was honored as South Dakota's Superintendent of the Year in 1985. Dennis, first of all, let me say welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And then secondly, if you've ever traveled the country and you see on the back of an RV, it's got a map of the United States and people fill them in as they drive from state to state. That's how that was my visual for your career. It's like, I've been everywhere.
Of 52 years, you have to move a little bit.
It's amazing to me and just such an honor to meet you. And you and I share a colleague and friend in Chris Gaines, and I was so pleased that he connected us. I'd like to begin with a question about perspective. So over the course of your 50-year career, As we mentioned, you've led school districts in Minnesota, Ohio, Missouri, Wyoming, and South Dakota. And I read that you've lived in 29 different homes. So there's a question there I have, certainly. But my bigger question is, with such a broad range of experiences, what are some of the key similarities that you've noticed in school leadership across all these different regions?
First of all, having been across that many years, I think I've actually been in 7 different decades. So, there's just been a change in leadership style, what's in, what's not in over that time. So
Everything from A Nation at Risk to No Child Left Behind to today's world of what has happened to the
whatever
Department of
that's
Education
going on today.
Yeah.
So, just that alone gives you a different perspective, because when I started, most superintendents were pretty autocratic. They ran their district, and that was, the board kind of served them instead of the other way around. And so that had started to change when I began back in the 60s. And so my more inclusive leadership was quite new at that time. That kind of became the way of superintendents doing it. And now you get a little more, some of them are very laissez-faire. They kind of let the district run itself. And, some superintendents still have a more autocratic model. So I've seen all of it. So it's hard to say this happened in Wyoming and that's happened in Ohio, because much of that was just the way things were going over those 7 decades. But the other thing that's really changed a lot of that is the relationship to the NEA. When I started as superintendent, superintendents were part of NEA. We were in the National Education Association, and we were pretty much tossed out of that group shortly after I became a superintendent. No connection, but
no connection, and it's not your fault that superintendents
not my fault.
were invited. Were invited to leave.
So, that alone has made a major change, because we're dealing with teachers differently. We're dealing with them often through their union rather than just as individual teachers or, schools of teachers. So that has impacted it quite a bit. I've seen quite a bit more micromanagement from legislators over the years. That's affected school management, and that varies from state to state. So Minnesota is much more legislature involved in running the schools. Wyoming, for example, South Dakota, pretty much, you do what you need to do in your school district to make it work for kids. And so, those are things that I would say are differences, and, some things that are similar.
So let me, if I may interrupt for one quick second, because you and I served in the same state. I was in Missouri. I was in Columbia. And maybe it was just a product of being in Columbia that I felt that the legislature was keenly aware of what we were doing, since we were almost a bedroom community for the Capitol. And so any decision we made that seemed to conflict maybe with the legislature, we certainly heard about it quite quickly, and were, I would put in air quotes, invited to come explain ourselves to a committee. I'm curious. So that's just sort of my aside.
Well, actually, I was 6 blocks from the Wyoming legislature. My office was 6 blocks.
In Minnetonka, yeah? Oh, no, in St. Paul, right? Yeah, of course. So we likely could, there's probably a club for superintendents like us.
You're right. That is different.
Yeah, we'll have to call Jennifer Cheatham, who is in Madison, Wisconsin, and join our little club of what it's like to be a superintendent so close to the orbit of the Capitol. You mentioned, and I think that is a really interesting perspective, having served over so many decades, and to see the transition from very much top-down decision-making with a board serving almost a supportive role to the superintendent of what can we do for you, as opposed to now boards are much more, at least in my experience in talking to superintendents around the country, are very much driving a lot of decisions, and the board and superintendent relationships, that has never been more important. It likely is a reason why superintendents are in the profession or in their communities for about 3 years before they move on, because that relationship hasn't been forged from the very beginning. And so you use the term inclusive leadership, and I wonder if you would expand on that in terms of how you advise leaders, experienced, new, and those in mid-career. What do you mean by inclusive leadership that they should really take note?
I'm actually working with the 6 aspiring superintendents through AASA, So
Wonderful.
I am advising superintendents regularly about what to do. And
You're a part of
I
the cohort,
advise
the
them.
aspiring superintendent cohort?
Yes, I'm a mentor.
Oh, that's
to-
amazing. I'm so glad that they get to leverage your wisdom. So then what is that advice? What does inclusive leadership look like?
First of all, I advise them to be courageous. You're never going to get anything accomplished unless you're courageous. So if you see issues that are not serving the best interests of students in your district or serving the constituents, you need to address them and fix them. And, too many superintendents turn their head and look the other way on those kinds of issues. And I advise them to, first of all, be courageous. But they've also got to work closely with their school board. They've got to have understandings of how they're going to work together and make those commitments, put them in writing and make those commitments firm so that everybody's on the same frequency, because the board can trip you up a little bit more now than maybe happened when I was starting out as a superintendent. The other part is be active in your community. Get to know your schools, know what's happening in your community as a whole, build those relationships on a broader scale than just within the school district. But certainly work with the teachers unions. When I was in Minnetonka, I think we had 8 different bargaining units. So you try to work with all of those bargaining units during bargaining as well as beyond bargaining. So the whole bargaining process has changed the relationship between the superintendent and the district. So, understand how those work, use them to your advantage, leverage them, but also don't let them dictate how you're going to do your work. That you need to be
Right. It will help inform your decision. Yeah, it'll help inform. But you have to imagine each of those 8 bargaining groups didn't sit in the mezzanine like you did, where they were all on the dance floor. So they understood their reality and their experience. You happened to be in the mezzanine, in the balcony, looking down and understanding how their interactions were going to impact each other and how they ultimately impact children. So
they all had self-interest. So, my interest was the students and the community. And so they saw part of the elephant, but they didn't see the whole elephant like superintendent.
exactly. That's a great metaphor as well. I would add, so where I was in Missouri, there is a new superintendent has been named. And so Jeff and I talked, and he indicated that when he listens to the podcast, he knows there are gems there because it has everything to do with the district he's now inheriting. So would share, so I'll share this one, Jeff, which is that when I first became a superintendent, I was advised by our school board association to ask each board member for 3 to 5 people. I typically did 3 that they thought were those thought leaders in the community that I should get to know. And it was the best advice because for 2 reasons. One, I got to understand who my board member valued in the community. And 2, I got to learn from the community member what was important to them. And I guess a third is there was this benefit that they would then call their friend and say, I'm so glad I got to meet this new superintendent and what a vision he has for the district. And I'm so excited for our community. And so there was just that other benefit as well. So I share that as a possible thing to share with aspiring soup because it really sort of got me on the right foot of understanding the values and the wishes of the community. And then what I took from you just a moment ago is I wish I had then codified that in some way by putting those commitments in writing so that when they were evaluating me, it was clear, this is what you told me you were evaluating me on. So if you're upset with me because of something that happened with a coach, we need to work through that. That ought not to be the part of the evaluation that influences how you feel about my continued ability to serve the district or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, those agreements up front really help a lot because you're doing that before you get into the heat of the battle. And you're not talking about something a board member has done already that's not appropriate. You're just talking in general. And so nobody owns the issues you're describing, and that you get them committed, you have them sign off on them. Not everybody's honorable and following things that they've signed, but it really holds their feet to the fire.
And then elections happen. And sometimes elections happen before you're formally evaluated. And so 2 new board members come on and they want to evaluate you in some other way. And you'll have an opportunity to set the new goals for next year. But right now, this is what we're evaluating him on.
That's right. So, absolutely.
The last thing I would say is I loved your point about collective bargaining can be contentious and it can raise tensions. And Yet there's more about we have common ground on so much that we want for children. And if you're not meeting with these groups outside of bargaining, then it's very high stakes. However, if you're really building rapport and have both collegiality and congeniality, then bargaining goes a lot better. And one example I would give is I met every month with our president and vice president with my entire cabinet, and they would bring working condition situations that we would work on together. That was outside of bargaining. That was just things and we had some set norms. Anything that you're bringing to these monthly conversations cannot be bargaining issues. These are about things that you're hearing that we can work on now so that they don't become bigger issues down the road. And then we would always report back. This is what we said last month. This is what we're working on. Here's the person that's going to work on that for you. And I really felt like that created a cultural field of respect. If you're just joining us on An Imperfect Leader, our guest today is Dennis Peterson, a retired superintendent with over 50 years of experience in public education and a leader known for his positive impact on school districts across multiple states. Dennis, in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension called nested patterns. It's the muscle of the work, and it tries to answer the question, how do we want to be together? And inside that dimension is a term, growth mindset. So with your permission, I'm going to explore open enrollment policies with a growth mindset, because I know that in the past, I certainly would have been very closed mindset on this. But I read that you have experience with open enrollment, and this is a topic of conversation in many states. Proponents see it as a way to expand opportunities for families, while opponents might worry about the unintended consequences, such as competition between districts, maybe loss of revenue, and that can lead to strained relationships between superintendents. So with a growth mindset in mind, how do you think districts can navigate these challenges while ensuring that all students, regardless of where they live, have access to a high quality education?
Certainly a big topic in education. And, I would say that open enrollment is a form of vouchers in a way. And so vouchers have always been seen negatively by a lot of educators. And I would say that I entered Minnesota with a negative attitude toward open enrollment. At the time I came into Minnetonka, they were losing about 2,000 students who lived in their district but went elsewhere. And so they were kind of a loser in that whole prospect or that whole thing, not only to private schools, but to other districts. And so I really made sure that open enrollment plan was part of our strategic plan. And so we really set about attracting families. And so over time, Minnetonka has now reached the point where they have about a third of their students who don't live in their district. They're all over, those students are open enrolled. So they attract students from all over the metro. Over 4,000 students come to Minnetonka through open enrollment. And it's made a big difference financially for Minnetonka. They've been able to offer a program they never would have offered based upon what the legislature was giving them. So it's like, obviously grew to like open enrollment and made that a centerpiece of what we were trying to accomplish. But all of that in our district was an effort to get those kids back from the private schools, from other districts. So it wasn't like we're out there trying to, entice students to come from.
Gotcha. So not like in Arizona where there are billboards that tell the neighboring district, hey, come over to our district, we're better.
Yeah. No, we don't do that.
Yeah.
Now we've got a neighboring district that we get 1,200 students from, another one with 900 students. So we understand that they don't appreciate that and they have some negative feelings toward the district. But my point about that is I'm not running Minnetonka School District to have great relationships with other districts. I'd like to have good relationships with them, but my students in Minnetonka deserve my best effort. And that's what I was making sure that we were doing through open enrollment. I watched Missouri, for example. There's a lot of resistance to open enrollment. And each year the legislature talks about doing it. One of these years, they'll probably put open enrollment in Missouri, and then they'll find out whether it works for them or not. But it works well for the districts that are able to bring in students. It puts pressure on the districts that are either losing students or not getting students from elsewhere to get a better program. Minnetonka didn't have the program that attracted students when I went there. By the time I left, they are the epitome of what people want in a school district and the Twin Cities. The other thing that changed, obviously, is when I went to school, you went to the school down the street. That was just the way it is. And now parents are willing to move their kids. We had people driving half an hour, sitting in traffic, sitting in front of the school for another 15, 20 minutes, coming early to pick up their kids. So, parents are willing to make those decisions now and realize that maybe their education efforts need to be put into a good elementary and secondary program and not worry quite as much about what college they get into.
That's helpful. I appreciate it. I'm going to continue to wrestle with this a little bit in terms of, I think it's a complex issue. When I think about where I was a superintendent, I was in a large district similar to Rockwood in the St. Louis area. We had incredible resources. My worry is less about losing students to the smaller districts in our county that are contiguous to ours, more about the possibility that those small districts will almost cease to exist if all of a sudden families want, particularly the high schools, the AP courses and so I don't know. I have a sense of, I hear what you're saying in terms of an obligation only to my community and to the county at large in terms of what that might mean for them. And maybe I just really need to kind of rethink that or kind of think, where are my priorities? And so I'm going to keep wrestling with it because I totally see what you're saying. You inherited a system. You didn't pursue it. And you saw what it was doing in your community by not being able to provide the kind of opportunities to kids. And by embracing it, building it into your strategic plan, you are now able to provide excellent opportunities for kids. And that is your job, to provide excellent opportunities for your kids. It helps with not just home values, but also for businesses to relocate to the area because they'll have their children attend your schools and great things will happen for their graduates. So it's good for everybody, I guess is what you're saying.
And it spurs other districts then to step up and provide a better education for their students. And often the old model they've had in their district isn't working for their parents. And so they find ways to compete and get their own kids back.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's a reason why they would drive 30 minutes, sit in traffic, and then wait another 15 minutes to pick up their child. And I wonder if it could then spur other innovations of saying, maybe there are partnerships that can be forged between these two districts, where if you've got a high school the north part of town, you've got kids from another community coming to your school district, might there be opportunities for that teacher to share with districts and try to expand opportunities as opposed to just say, I guess I'm trying to find, where do you find win-wins as opposed to winners and losers?
No, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. I'd like to ask you a question that I ask every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Based upon my own religious values, I know I'm imperfect and, I do the best I can. And if I do make mistakes, I try to fix those and not have them be a problem for people. Because that's one of the issues of being a leader like a superintendent is your mistakes can get magnified and they impact other people. And as you know, everything we do impacts somebody negatively or positively. And so you have to take your imperfections seriously and try to make sure that as much as possible, you're making good decisions, first of all, but you're willing to also go back and fix them if they're not right.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest today is Dr. Dennis Peterson, a retired superintendent with over 50 years of experience in public education. Now, in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. So, Dennis, what happened?
Mine's a pretty big one. Obviously, over the years, I've had several things that I felt I needed to fix, but this was a big one. And back in the early 1990s, I was superintendent in a district in Missouri called Rockwood, and they were growing about 1,000 students a year. So we had to really keep ahead of that growth with having facilities. So we had a committee that put together a plan for building 2 more high schools, 2 more middle schools, some elementary schools, and some large additions on other schools. And we had the cost of that estimated for us by a large construction firm, one of the largest in the world. And so we found out that we had to do that for the bond issue. So we ran a big bond issue, the biggest one in the St. Louis region at that time. And we discovered after we had done it and started work with the architects that we didn't have enough money, that the estimate was too low for the projects that we had. So, here we sit. We paid all those promises to people, the voters, the students, the staff, all of that we were going to build all these projects. And so we had to figure out what to do. Either we cut back on the projects, we cut out some of them, or we'd find more money to do all the work. So my choice was to find more money to do all the work. At that time, St. Louis had a desegregation program going that had students coming out to Rockwood from central St. Louis City, about 2,600 kids at that time. And so the state of Missouri was willing to pay for facilities for those students. So I worked with the state of Missouri. We got additional money to enable us to meet our commitments to people and save face for everybody. But mainly, we were able to meet the needs of students. So, it was a real learner. I had to learn a lot about relying upon one company to tell us what our costs would be and find more ways to work with other people to get advice about all that.
So I'd love to dig into this a little bit. What a great learning experience, particularly for school districts across the country who, many of them are trying to figure out how to deal with declining enrollment and budgets. And there are many who are also inheriting past decisions to wait to build. And they kept changing attendance areas to try to shift kids around, and they can't do that anymore. But they're in a position where they need to build. Now, if I understand correctly, you are in Missouri. Missouri requires, I think it was 57% for a bond. So your community stepped up and said, yes, we'll fund this. And you got a quote from a construction company. Was this as part of an RFP process that they bid and said this is what it would cost, and then you went to the community, or they sort of did an analysis and that was the number you took to the community?
Yeah, we had a working relationship with them.
Gotcha. So you had a sort of a contracted.
We just got the estimate for the bond issue.
Gotcha. Okay, so you take it to the community, and then as costs are coming in and the cost of materials, the cost to, as they do the evaluation of they do an environmental evaluation, they do a ground soil evaluation, they realize, they have to go deeper, or they have to do all these different things. And it turned out it was going to be a lot more expensive. And so what would you say? I think you alluded to it, but I'd love for you just to say it again, if that's all right. What would you say got overlooked in this process?
I think what got overlooked is that we didn't get enough information. We took the estimate from one company. We may not have given them enough information from the architects. So we should have had architects more involved up front to help them give us a good estimate. And so both of those were mistakes. And so we had to move beyond the mistake. We accepted the mistake, but we needed to meet our obligation to the voters.
How did you talk about the mistake publicly?
We just described what had happened, that we had relied upon this number and that we were determined to follow through and do all the projects. So we didn't renege on our commitment at all. We put the burden back on ourselves to find the money to do that.
To what extent was your board concerned that you were going to ask to have them go to the public again to authorize another election or, bond election?
I don't think that ever became an option we discussed in depth.
Yeah.
We just,
You just said, I'll
the
figure this
burden
out.
the burden is on the superintendent to fix this.
What did you learn about relationships?
That you need to, first of all, know who you're working with. Secondly, you have to include people that maybe you hadn't thought needed to be a part of the process at that point. They would have a role at some point, but maybe not then. So I brought in my perspective on how to do that. So, it really taught me that you have to get much more information if you're dealing with something that big.
Who are those additional people? What perspectives are you bringing? Are you saying other construction companies who might have a different perspective, or engineers, or traffic studies?
More construction companies who can tell you what they think it would cost, and then also the architectural firms. So, if I'm describing something to you that is called a school that's going to hold 2,000 students, that can either be 300,000 square feet or 250,000 square feet. That makes quite a difference which one we choose.
Yeah.
And so I think the original estimate came for a $250,000 school or square foot school. And when we wanted to build a 300,000 square foot school.
Understood. So including the people most impacted by, I was thinking about including the people most impacted by that decision. So, are you a comprehensive high school? Are you going to have athletics, a full range of athletic opportunities? Are you going to have what we call career and technical education now, or vocational programming? How are you using your fields? Who's going to use your fields? Is it a community center as well as a school? All those types of things. I imagine when you look back, it says, when we start with them, then the architect fully understands what we're trying to build. And then that gives us a more accurate look at what this will cost to build it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. My experience with building, we also were a growing community, still growing. And I thought we really made a shift when we started to also include teachers and custodians and food services in the process of developing what the school would look like, because they know best the flow of kids, the flow of their product, the need for storage. And it started to develop, I think, better schools. And then secondly, to your point of including additional construction teams does, I think, two things. One, it keeps the original relationship you have pretty honest, because they know that they have to do a good job. They can't be just comfortable knowing that they're going to be the choice. And then secondly, it gives you an opportunity to see different perspectives and innovative ways to accomplish what you're trying to do.
Yeah, we certainly used what you've described as part of our secondary process of including, the people who teach art to help us design the art. We're having, teachers involved there after the bond issue. So, it's clearly a matter of how much detail do you put into a plan before you go to the voters and how much do you put in after. And so you've got to have a pretty good number if you're building as much as we were building back then.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then you think about your community, there have to be pieces of that bond that really speak to their wishes as well. So having those sort of world cafes or conversations, because to me, I was a musician, I was more into performing arts. So I didn't think much about why it would be important to have turf fields. That's really important to your football and your soccer and potentially lacrosse teams. And then making sure that even practice fields are not going to create a situation where kids are going to get injured because those facilities are not as nice. And so always include things that are going to really bring out the people to vote. What frustrated you through this situation?
First of all, I was frustrated that the construction company that, gave us the estimate wasn't more accurate and hadn't done more of that research themselves. But, I put the blame back on myself. Really, I should have done more up front. And so, I've always been willing to own my mistakes, and we'll do something about it. We're going to have to live with what we've been given and try to make it work. So, I don't know that I spent a lot of time on frustration as much as I did trying to find a solution. And,
Sure.
And we did find a solution.
Yeah. So that's the last question, which is in the end, what was something that was good that came out of this? And what I heard you say is that you leverage your relationships at the state level to be able to make good on the program that existed in terms of the DSEG program, children who are coming to your district who did not reside in your district, and the opportunity to leverage those funds to be able to I guess, bridge the gap Is that what you would say was
that's right.
what came?
That's where we're there. Yep.
Yeah. I would say that your legacy in Rockwood, because when Eric Knos was there, I got to see the program that they were doing it was entrepreneurship and algebra. And it was on A days, kids were learning algebra. And on B days, they had a t-shirt company because everything in the high schools requires t-shirts.
Yeah.
Then there was another
Right.
innovative program that was there that was geometry and home building. And so on A days, kids learned geometry. On B days, they applied those principles of geometry to build a tiny home that then got donated to some nonprofit that was supporting the unhoused and became a real community treasure. And so Rockwood, your legacy, absolutely, because of the facilities you're able to provide, allowed those who followed you to stand on your shoulders and do marvelous things as well for kids. And then, of course, Curtis Kane is there now and is doing a marvelous job there. Mark Miles is a
Well,
friend.
I'm very,
So
very proud of Eric. Yeah, Eric was a music teacher when I was superintendent here. So I've known Eric for
was he a
long
drummer,
time.
right? He's a drummer.
Great guy.
Yeah, I stay in touch with him and I'm always inspired by him. And what I learned from him, even though we sometimes made fun of him for always taking a selfie with kids, he was, as you had indicated at the very beginning of our conversation about being active in your community, he was able to demonstrate and show his involvement and presence. He wasn't someone who was just sitting in a classroom. He was in schools and doing things. And
Right.
and certainly I feel, the pandemic cut Mark Miles' time short, but he is also, he was in Cincinnati, Ohio area as well before coming back to Missouri, his roots, and was doing marvelous things. And of course, Curtis Kane, Superintendent of the Year at the national level, being able to represent Rockwood. So what a legacy in terms of incredible leaders that followed you.
Well, there have been some great ones. Yeah.
May I ask you a question that I sometimes leave time for? And I think this is an important one because you're leading this work along with other colleagues. What advice would you give to an aspiring leader? And I know you gave me some at the beginning, but maybe part of this conversation prompted an additional thought.
First of all, I would tell them it's a great job. Often if you're in a school district, you hear complaints about the superintendent and concerns, it's just part of the work. But it's a very rewarding job, and they can have a big impact on the future of students and the future of our country. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to lead and to develop things that will make a difference in the long term. So that's the first advice I give them is, don't be turned off by the criticism you hear about your current superintendent. Learn from that person's mistakes. Learn from that person's successes. Always look to ways that you can improve, but don't ignore your opportunity to be a superintendent. Not many people get that opportunity.
Our guest today was Dr. Dennis Peterson, a retired superintendent with over 50 years of experience in public education, a leader known for his positive impact on school districts across multiple states. And Dennis, as I reflect on our conversation today, I will go with the umbrella of inclusive leadership and how you've demonstrated that in multiple states. And when I think of that, I think of shared leadership, distributive leadership. I think of when you talked about having a authentic and genuine relationship with your teachers' unions and all employee groups. I think about the relationship and the importance of having a relationship with your legislature and how you did that in Minnesota. And certainly in the example that you gave in segment 2, you had to have some kind of relationship for them to say, yes, let's support Rockwood and make sure that your facility needs are met. And you talked about the impact of decisions and being just mindful of the decisions we make and the impact that they have. I have so many other examples that I've written down here, but I just, more than anything, I'm grateful for your time, grateful for your service, and for you to remind all of us, particularly those who are going into the job, that we need them more than ever. Now, more than ever, we need great leaders leading our school districts and our communities.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Jamie, we are back, and I want to share with you, we went right into the conversation talking about 1967. The superintendent who I knew from that era, Russ Thompson, superintendent from the early 70s until 1990 something, and I still see him from time to time. In fact, we would have lunch probably 3 times a year. And I saw him recently. I was in Columbia, Missouri for a bat mitzvah. And so I brought together the superintendents of the past with the newly named superintendent to sort of share. And it was really neat. And I know you've given me grief in the past for not recording it because it would have been pretty cool. Anyhow.
It would have been awesome. It would have been awesome.
Sorry.
And you can call me to those meetings to just be the interviewer. I would love to.
That would have been great. In those conversations we've had over the years, when you were, as we were going into right before the recording of this conversation with Dennis Peterson, it made me think about when he would say to me, like, tell me what's happening right now. And I'd say, oh my God. I mean, it's like, I'll make a decision or we'll make a decision. And unless the person was in the room, they feel as if they weren't a part of that conversation, and then immediately just hammer everybody on social media. And it was really interesting to watch his perspective of I don't even understand what that means, because that wasn't a thing. I didn't have to worry about those kinds of things. We would do a press release. It would be in the paper, and then everybody would learn. And in the conversation with Dennis Peterson, he kind of not alludes to it, he says it pretty, clearly, talking about the evolution of the school leadership and external pressures. And he said, the superintendent and the dynamics of school leadership have changed significantly. He said when he started, that most superintendents were just pretty autocratic, and the board kind of served them instead of the other way around. And it's so true. I was like, oh my gosh, it's so true. You have very active boards who want to be very involved in the day-to-day operations, as opposed to being providing advice and guidance and a community perspective to the work that's going on. And then he also talked about seeing more micromanagement from the legislature over the years. And I'm like, yes, particularly around school management. Absolutely. And so in his after action review, when he talks about, my gosh, we went out for a bond, we passed the bond, and it turned out it wasn't enough money. And I went to the state government and asked them for some help, and they provided the assistance that we needed in terms of money. I thought, that doesn't happen anymore. There's just no way to say, like, that's not my problem. You want local control? Control it locally. Good luck.
I thought it was funny that you asked, what would you change, or something you would have done differently in the after action review? He's like, yeah, I probably should have gotten more information from the architects.
I appreciated that humility. That's
it's evident. That's evident.
I know.
The construction company you got a bid from was wrong. That was funny. That, I think, is a great insight in terms of the longevity, both in terms of the perspective and longevity of his superintendencies, as well as the difference between 2025 and the times that but even in Superintendent of the Year in 2009, it's still a different beast in 2009. And so here's what I think has changed, what I think has changed, and what he may not have had to navigate too much is the weaponization of social media. And I do like that he sees the difference between the autocrat and someone who's working in conjunction with their board, or the board directing the superintendent, and how that changes the way in which a leader can lead. And, suddenly the concept of bold leadership ends up being taking a stand against your board.
Yes. When I asked what kind of advice do you have, he talked about being courageous. And I thought to myself, like, I don't know if I should have asked for an example, and I think you've just provided it, is that you may have to, I have a friend who's a superintendent who brought something to the board and they voted no 7-0, and he was okay with it. And I remember asking, like, really? He's like, yeah. It wasn't a hill to die on kind of thing. I thought that was kind of interesting.
It's interesting. So he's okay with indicating that he disagrees, but he also just, in this case, he takes it.
Yeah, I have to remember what all the circumstances were. And so but I just remember, because my first instinct or my first response was like, yikes. Like, I wouldn't bring anything forward if I didn't know I had, obviously, the 4 votes in a 7-member board. And more so than that, I would want to make sure I had 5 votes. 5-2 is still a firm majority, as opposed to 4-3 where you kind of squeak in.
Yeah.
Because then you're holding the bag if things go wrong, as opposed to, we made this decision together. You're like, I told you it wasn't going on. And one person would be like, I had reservations, but I trusted you, so I voted for it. No, you want 5-2, 6-1, 7-0, 4-3 only if you have a fiercely divided board and they are really in their camps and you're doing this for the right reasons, kind of thing.
Tell me a little bit about what your own personal perspective on open enrollment, in that what you end up saying at the end is, oh, you really gave me something to think about. I really have to think about this. And I'm like, oh, I think he's just not disagreeing to him. I think he's not disagreeing with him.
I'm too polite of a host. I'm so polite. So here's the thing. I have colleagues in Arizona who are either superintendents or education adjacent. So they provide trainings throughout the state of Arizona. And they tell me about what open enrollment has done to their state and to the relationships between professionals. We go into education because we believe in supporting children, and it shouldn't be that. So you see, I'm still struggling with this. So in Arizona, school districts will put up billboards to compete with their neighbors to say, come to our district, because it's life or death in terms of funding to recruit people to come to you. And so as opposed to taking the perspective of how do we improve opportunities and outcomes for everyone, and if a district needs additional support, then they ought to get it, as opposed to let's just let them like die on the vine, and those who couldn't figure out how to get out are going to be casualties in this approach to reform. And I guess maybe that's where, if I get all the way down to my beliefs, principles, and values, it's that piece about reform versus transformation. And reform still, for me, is sort of coaching for compliance, high pressure. And this just seems to be a tool in terms of having winners and losers. And so that's really where I was like, you've given me something to think about. And I'll tell you, he did, if I'm being honest, because he talked about, well, my job, I'm hired by this district to do my very best for this district. And I'd never really thought of it that way. I've always sort of approached it from, when you're in a school and you have a professional learning community, you're not saying, I'm in it for my classroom. No, I'm in it for my grade. And I've got these colleagues across the hall, and we all, like when we all win, like when all kids succeed, we all win. And that's kind of how I approached it from the superintendency of, we're all districts in the same county. So when we all do well, we all win. And
so, my counter question, I have a counter question to his comment.
You asked me, and I'm just like, whoa, it really blew my mind, because I typically anticipate what someone's going to say.
Yeah.
Like,
I loved that. I like it. I like when you are in a position where you're like, oh, that is so different than what I would think.
Yeah.
And that obviously you and I have value systems that are about supporting every kid. And I think that I'm not saying Dennis doesn't. My counter question would be, or my follow-up question when he says, I'm responsible for the kids, in this case, it was Minnetonka, I believe, would be, if that's true, why are we worrying about kids that aren't in Minnetonka? Why are we spending any time or effort recruiting, considering anybody who doesn't already go to
from a financial perspective? It is.
Got that part. I got that. Yeah, I got that part.
Look at all these things I can fund now.
Yeah. So then basically you're worrying about recruiting other kids to get the money.
Yeah. And more often than not, it seems like you're recruiting kids who have fewer needs, and they don't have any kind of special requirements or interventions that are going to be needed, because these are families who are going to provide transportation, and they're going to, when he said that, they'll drive 30 minutes across town. And then, so who's more likely than not able to do that?
Exactly. 100%. And so all you have to do is offer some
$10,000, $12,000, $16,000 per kid from the state, or a combination of state and local funds and some federal. And now they can invest in really innovative programs. And I totally get it. It's just that it creates a winners and losers. I mean, it's where I struggle with charters. Unless you're a charter school that holds on to kids and does everything, and, or if you're a charter that's like, it's not working out for you, go back to your public schools. When you create a two-tier system, I oppose it. When you create a complementary system, because you're able to maybe do some things that you couldn't have been able to do in a traditional public school setting, I'm okay with those.
So what prevents us from, maybe I'm just asking it. This is Jamie, the not superintendent, asks a silly question. What prevents us from not just collaborating with districts across districts, or collaborating with districts?
Oh, you can.
Why?
You can.
Why bother with open enrollment except for money? And then it's money.
Yeah. You can. Certainly school districts do it with their CTE programs, so because why would you both create a welding program when one could do welding and one could do cosmetology, or one could do robotics or something like that? And so they enter into partnerships. They have to figure out busing, and they got to work on their schedules. And sometimes that creates a problem, because one is traveling to the other, and it takes time to get there. And the school day starts.
But those are technical problems.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Those
totally.
Are
sometimes people get upset about it, and they just pull stakes and create their own. There are great examples of partnerships between and among districts. And I think you're speaking to an innovation that ought to be explored more. How to do that, and how to share the costs in a lot of different ways, right?
So
because you might have the very best physics teacher who's also certified through NASA to do some type of, aeronautics course, right? And so then you could be providing in both districts, but then you also have to align your pay scales and your collective bargaining agreement. There are certain pieces that they are technical, but they sometimes become insurmountable.
Yeah, they're big. I understand that. I see that. But to that effect, we are partnered with a district where it would make, in order to build sustainable professional learning for multiple different leadership teams, we should be doing this in partnership with another district. And because if you do, then you're sharing because the numbers of teams that my organization facilitates doesn't matter. Like, I want it smaller is easier. But if you get up, let's say 80 teams, that's a lot of people. And there's some technicals, venue, where do we meet? Where should we go and meet? And are our values aligned? All that kind of stuff. But if you do that, the budget, it's cheaper.
That's interesting. I hadn't even thought about the budget. I was thinking about now you have a regional set of values that you're working on. And then you now have a whole collaborative team of people who work in different districts who can be your thought partners, who can problem solve, to share ideas, to create lesson plans together, all of that kind of stuff.
That's all the positive.
It's so transformative. Yeah.
But it comes down to, especially in 2025, I can bring the budget down if we do this.
Sometimes that's the motivator.
I wish it weren't. But
let me say this last thing though, that why I was still struggling with the question, or why you really made me think about something. I'm competitive by nature. Like I just, with sport, with games, it's sometimes unhealthy. And I would say when he said, quote, "My students in Minnetonka deserve my best effort." And that's what I was making sure that we were doing through open enrollment.
Right.
And he said, it puts pressure on the districts that aren't to get a better program. And I thought to myself, could it potentially serve as a motivator to say, we're bleeding kids. What are we not doing that they're doing that we can up our game, as opposed to, look, we're still going to get the same amount of money per kid per year from the state, and we'll just maintain the same programs. It's a very much a deficit model of thinking about the people who are working their tails off in school districts. It did make me think though about, could this serve as a motivator? Maybe. I don't know. I want to think about it more. So I haven't stopped thinking about it. So we're coming to the end of our year, the school year. And you asked me at the beginning, like, was this intentional? How did you decide to choose Dennis as we're coming here in June? And I would say definitely, as legislation continues to be proposed, adopted, as pressure still mounts on school districts, to provide some thought for others to think about just their own place in this educational environment.
I deeply appreciate, it makes me want to say, I'd like to get connected to more long-term superintendents. I think it's really interesting to see someone who's been the superintendent in multiple decades. And what's the Post-it? What is the Post-it that you have, that Jamie's Post-it that you have on your desk?
Why didn't
what does it say?
Why didn't you?
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions here. Like, why didn't you ask him, what is the key difference? What did he notice in each decade? What's something that you noticed in
that would have been a good one.
From the 70s to the 80s to the 90s. Superintendency and all of those. That's just amazing. It's really amazing.
All right. This has been fun.
Yes, it has been fun.
I will see you next week.
I'm looking forward to it, as always.
You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. All right. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, see you next week. Take care.